Bows and arrows have been around for thousands of years, and characters who use them can be found in everything from ancient myths and cave paintings to modern day films, video games and YouTube channels. And when a modern day artist, animator or actor wants to portray one of these characters, it's not surprising that they often turn to the most prestigious source available: Olympic target archery. But that might not be the best approach. In this video, I'm going to talk about the problems with Olympic style archery, as well as talk about some other techniques which could work better for historical and fantasy characters. Hi, my name's David, aka Bloomineck. I'm an archer, a performer, and a trick shooter. And this is fantasy archery. Why is fantasy so popular? For thousands of years, humans have been telling stories, some realistic, some impossible, and others which lie somewhere in between. Because it is one of the great gifts of humanity that we can take spoken and written words and turn them into images in our heads and feelings in our hearts. And the new perspectives and experiences we find in those stories can give us frameworks to help with real life, or ways to escape from it. Without even leaving the house, we can experience the thrills of a rooftop chase, the joy of new possibilities, and the bittersweet sensation of marching to one last hopeless fight with a team of friends and allies. And if that sounds like your jam, check out One Last Fight. It's a card-based role-playing game where you play as a group of doomed adventurers heading out for one last mission against their greatest nemesis. You can play with 1 to 4 players using different archetypes and abilities, and it changes every time you play it. And because you don't actually need a GM or indeed other players, it's very easy to just pick up and dive into. Since the Kickstarter went live, it has stormed past its initial targets. So if you want to get in on the action, check out the link below or in my bio and join your friends or go solo for one last fight. Olympic target recurve is, without a shadow of a doubt, the most accurate way to shoot a recurve bow. Because if it wasn't, they'd be using the other one instead. The main restriction in the Olympics is that you have to use a recurve bow and you have to be more accurate than your competition. They shoot at 70 meters, which is a very long way, and they shoot at a target face which is 12 centimeters across. They are really good. I'm not trying to throw any shade on Olympians at all. They are way better than I am at what they do. But the thing about Olympic archery is, like any other Olympic sport, it is highly specialized for what it is. And what it is accuracy at long range with no time restrictions. You have a very long time to prep and line up your shot, make sure everything's perfect, and that is absolutely fantastic for a fictional character who is a sniper who has that time and space. But even then, Olympic archery kind of starts to fall apart if you try that same technique, say, while crouching, because you can no longer get the bottom limb of the bow sorted. So if you're in a cramped environment or hunting in the woods, you'll find that most hunters use variants of this technique rather than perfect Olympic form. The other problem with this, as you can see when I go through it, is that it's slow. I'm placing my arrow on one side of the bow, migrating my hand around to the other side, and then very carefully drawing back. And if you do Olympic style recurve, you'll have to forgive my form because this is not my specialty. But the thing is, even if I want to speed it up, there's a limit to how fast I can go, because this bit in the middle here, where I swap my hand from one side to the other, is always going to take time out of the smoothness of my draw. And that is because this technique was not developed to be used in high pressure, high speed situations. It is a sports technique, designed, developed and honed for use in open spaces with plenty of time against static targets. And while there are many historical battles where the archers did stand in an open field and shoot, if not at a static target, then at a massed block of enemies in the distance, for a hero character, as portrayed by Hollywood, that is not what you tend to see them doing. Because they're running and jumping and crouching and stabbing somebody in the eye and then making a shot, and all of these things are quite difficult to do smoothly and effectively with this technique. And if you're trying to do all those things with Olympic style target archery, you've got a few problems. One, is that the 3 fingers underneath technique does not really hold the arrow very securely. If I jump, it comes off the bow. And that is not going to go where I want it to. And of course, as mentioned before, it's relatively slow to get lined up for your shot. And most of the time, that makes 0 difference, because in films and animation, they aren't shooting real arrows. Usually, you'll see that they have some kind of CGI that just puts the arrow in afterwards, and that's a safety feature, but it also allows you to get away with a lot of this stuff. But the problem with that is that you're then trying to put an arrow into a movement that doesn't work, because the actor has been doing this, and you now have to CGI an arrow which comes over, hits the riser, and then miraculously is on the other side of it. And if you look at video games like Skyrim or Horizon or films like The Avengers, and you look closely at what's going on with the bow, you'll realize that has to be what's happening, because there is no other way that they are just pulling that arrow straight down onto the bow and it sits on the side they want. You could bring it down to the other side, but now your fingers have to pass through the string, which is another thing that happens sometimes. Or you can thread it through the gap in the bow. But that is a very obvious motion that you don't see happening in those kind of films. So, from a purely practical standpoint, if you're training an actor or running an animation sequence and you want it to look smooth, venturing away from standard Olympic-style archery is probably going to give you slightly better results. The other reason you might want to step away from standard Olympic-style target archery is that it's designed to be done with standard Olympic-style recurve bows. And the vast majority of bows in history were not those. They would have probably looked a little more similar to something like this, although this is a modern variant. You can see this one, the modern recurve, has a shelf cut out on it. This one doesn't. This one is also quite a lot shorter if we're looking at historical Asiatic horse bows. It could be quite a lot longer if we're looking at a longbow, but either way, that's going to change how you use it. So even if you're just looking for authenticity, the majority of fictional characters are probably not shooting in the Olympics or in standard target competitions, and they are probably going to be more likely to use a different technique that was used historically. When it comes to looking at alternative techniques, there are a couple of elephants in the room that I want to cover. The first one is the reverse draw. This style has recently become a lot more popular in films, TV, and video games, possibly as a result of a viral video that came out a while back. But it has been around for a lot longer than that. And the big advantage of it is that it solves the problem of knocking on one side and then transferring your hand around by not transferring your hand around. You simply bring your hand onto the string, knock, and then continue to draw with your hand in the same position. And unlike a lot of speed shooting styles, it also works on a modern recurve with an arrow shelf, which means that regardless of what bow you're using, you can just have your actor practice that movement and CGI everything in nicely. As a practical style, there are a couple of things to remember about it. One is that it is definitely harder to aim than standard recurve because your arrow is further from your face, which can make it reasonably good for instinctive styles of shooting, but you have to bear that in mind. Two is that if you are not careful, there's a really strong tendency for you to pull the arrow away from the bow as you draw back, because the twist of your hand is going that way, whereas normally the twist of your hand will pull the arrow into the bow and keep it nice and secure. And that means that if you're using a traditional bow that doesn't have that shelf cut out, there's a tendency for the arrow to not properly bend around the bow in the archer's paradox, and so it doesn't necessarily then even out and fly quite as straight. And they have a tendency to kind of skip off the bow and fishtail a bit in the air. Again, not a problem if you're using CGI arrows, but if you're looking at from a historical standpoint, or if you're trying to develop a culture that uses bows, that could be an issue for them in that they are less accurate at long range compared with other cultures. And of course, historically, this was probably very rare. There is a total of about one historical source that shows someone doing something that looks kind of like this. But it did exist, it has been used, and there's no particular reason someone couldn't have thought it up. It's just that if your culture already has their own speed shooting technique and you're aiming for authenticity in your filming, it's probably best to go with that. But if you're going for fantasy, or you're making a hero character that does something different, or you just don't care, then the reverse draw is a pretty decent technique to overcome the other issues. The other elephant in the room is Lars Anderson, in what I believe is the most watched archery video ever. He talks about a technique where you hold multiple arrows in your hand at once, you filter them through the fingers, and you make fast and rapid shots. It was a technique that was used by Saracen horse archers, and there is no doubt that it is incredibly fast, being capable of shooting an arrow every 0.5 seconds from a relatively lightweight bow. The crux of this technique is that you have multiple arrows in your hand, and then you just feed them onto the string, one after the other, after the other. Sort of like using a magazine in a more conventional firearm. Was it used historically as often as that video makes out? Almost certainly not, because there are a whole bunch of reasons why you wouldn't want to use it. One is that if you plan on using this hand for anything else, you can't. It's full of arrows. Two is if you plan on having more arrows than in your hand, you need a quiver anyway. And three is that it's not as accurate or as powerful as shooting with only one arrow in your hand. Because my hand that is doing my drawing is occupied with multiple things. So while I'm shooting this first arrow, I'm also trying to control the remaining arrows. It doesn't take a lot of concentration, but if you're using a technique that requires a lot of power, using the rest of your hand for something else at a different angle reduces how much force you can put through your hand. And it also changes the way that your hand sits, forcing you into a slightly less relaxed position, which makes it a bit less accurate for long-range shooting. But when it works, by God does it work. And there are very, very good reasons to include it for a character who is a hero or a badass or someone who has developed this technique to an art form. Plus, you get kudos from all the people that watch that original video and think that this is the best way to shoot arrows ever. But the downside to it is that it takes a lot more focus, practice, and training to get someone to a point where they look competent with it than just standard one-arrow techniques. And it also takes a lot more effort from your CGI crew to make it look right, especially if the person doing it isn't holding multiple arrows, because the hand's probably going to be in the wrong position and the arrows are going to pass through their fingers, and it's going to look weird in close-ups. But what about characters that aren't fast? They're not looking to make 30 shots in 5 seconds. They're looking to make every shot count. Well, for a lot of historical cultures, that was the case, because if you're fighting enemies who are in armor, and you have loads of archers, then you can achieve volume of fire just by having lots of you. What you really need is for every shot to have the chance to take out an enemy. And that is when a draw designed for power becomes more important than a style developed for speed. And in this case, we're going to look less at what goes on with the hands and more at what goes on with the body. Because war techniques have been used with thumb draws, and they've been used shooting off this side of the bow, or they've been used shooting off this side of the bow with Mediterranean draw. It doesn't matter too much. But what does matter is how you engage the muscles in your body to get the most power out of your bow. Because most people, up to a certain point, will be absolutely fine shooting a bow in the kind of Mediterranean style of draw. But as you cycle through the draw weight, increasing it further, it gets harder and harder to maintain the power in that draw, because you're pulling across your body in a way that's not especially effective. So in cultures that did use heavier draw weight bows, they tended to bring the bow higher and draw over the eye into this position. This lets you engage the lateral muscles, and with a bit of a tilt from the hips, you can engage the muscles in the lower back right from the start of the draw. And the difference in muscle engagement is fairly stark. If we're trying to draw a standard Mediterranean style, we're mostly using the muscles in the upper shoulders and not effectively engaging the lats. If we bring it into more of a warbow style, bringing the weight forwards, tilting from the hips and engaging the back, we can use the entire of the back in that draw. Which means we can pull a much, much heavier weight back have a lot more power from it, and still maintain the kind of control that we need to be accurate. The other advantage of using a technique like this is that it takes you from a draw length like here into one that sits a lot further back on the body, allowing you to get more length out of the bow and put even more power in the arrow. So for a character where you want to emphasize their strength and power, having them engage a draw that takes them all the way back to here really emphasizes how strong they are, while also being relatively easy for the actors to mime without needing to shoot any actual arrows. So far I've mostly had a look at draws that involve using your fingers in a way that is fairly similar to the Mediterranean, at least for the hand that's drawing back the bow. But for this one, I'd like to move on to having a look at a thumb draw. Although they can look unusual if you're used to finger draws, thumb draws have been practiced across all of Asia and Eastern Europe for a very long time, and have been used by some of the most successful archer cultures ever. And while there are lots and lots of different forms of thumb draw, at base, it's as simple as using your thumb rather than your fingers on the bow. And this has a whole bunch of advantages. One is that the pressure created by the thumb and the index finger holds the arrow onto the bow. So if you're tilting about, riding on a horse, or jumping in the air, you can keep that arrow in position until you're ready to shoot. It also leaves the rest of your hand free, so you can hold extra arrows or even a backup weapon and still shoot. And because the arrow shoots off of the thumb side of the bow rather than the knuckle, you can employ a technique known as a hatra, where you extend the string away from the bow as you shoot, which means the arrow doesn't need to bend as much, which lets you get much straighter arrow flights. It's also a very historically accurate way to portray archery for a variety of cultures, and can be used with a nice long draw as well. The big downside of this draw for animation or practical purposes is that it's a little bit harder to tell what's going on with the hands. So if you've got your actor just doing this on a regular basis, it kind of looks like they're just pinching the string instead of wrapping their thumb around it. And that leads to a lot of art animations and even actors who are actually just pinching the string like this, which, as you can see, is very difficult to achieve with a bow that's even only 45 pounds. But if you get it right, it can look really, really cool. And then the last style that we're going to have a look at for today is the Slavic draw. Slavic draw is essentially a cousin of the thumb draw, but using fingers on the string. By using the index finger pressed against the arrow, you can keep it pressed against the bow, which gives you the same kind of support that you would have otherwise had from your thumb and index finger, allowing you to do lots of weird and wonderful shots. But it also gives you a lot of control over the arrow as you index it, allowing you to bring it very quickly and smoothly onto the string. And indeed works very, very well as a hand position for the Saracen archery mentioned earlier. But it's also a speed shooting technique that has been used by the speed archer Mihai Cosme to set world records for fastest speed for shooting single arrows from a quiver, and it has recently become my favourite draw style after I adapted from my previous way of shooting Mediterranean draw off the thumb. In theory, Slavic draw suffers from the same problem as reverse draw, in that your hand and the arrow are on the same side, which can reduce the amount of control and affect the archer's paradox. But because the side that they're on happens to be the thumb side rather than the knuckle, it lets you engage the kata I mentioned before for horse archery, which stabilizes out the archer's paradox and gets you a nice, fast and clean shot. And because you're using the index finger to keep the arrow in place, you don't have to worry about this happening. From a technical standpoint, this is relatively easy, both to draw, literally, to draw, theoretically, and to mime, if you're just acting in a film. All you got to do is keep your fingers straight. The main practical disadvantage of this technique is that while it's still using 3 fingers, it's using your weaker 3 instead of the stronger 3. So it can be a little more tricky to engage a heavy draw, though not impossible with practice. So if you're looking for a style for an archer that is fast, with the option to be even faster, accurate, and versatile, I hope this video has given you an idea of some of the diverse techniques that exist outside of the modern Olympics. Thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, all the usual stuff. If you'd like to support me in making more of them, my Patreon is listed down below, where you'll also find art references for all these archery styles. And if you'd like to learn any of them, the College of Arrows school community is also linked down there too. Just bear in mind that archery has been around a lot longer than written history and has covered almost every continent we've ever occupied. So there are a lot of styles out there, way more than I could cover in this video. So go out, find some, mess around and have fun. And if you can do it with a bow now, it's probably been done before.